In this show, Brooding in Profound Silence, we're going to be focusing on two passages from the book of creation, passage 1:3 and 1:4. So, Dan, give our viewers out there a quick look ahead at what we're doing in this program.
As science explores deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole, there's a truth that keeps popping up that they just don't like to talk about. That of a spiritual absolute upon which the entire universe is constructed. If this is true, then there must have been something that existed before matter. So then, what did exist before the beginning, and what would it be like to live there?
That, and one more question that comes to my mind: what is matter?
There's a good question.
There you go.
Well, let's see if we can find out.
That's right. Let's work this one with the viewers. So with that, I'm going to read creation 1:3 and 1:4. Before the beginning, there was only one consciousness, that of the Eternal One, whose nature cannot be expressed in words. It was the one soul spirit, the self-generator, which cannot diminish, the unknown, unknowable, one brooding solitary and profound pregnant silence. The name which is uttered cannot be that of this great being who, remaining nameless, is the beginning and the end. Beyond time, beyond the reach of mortals, and we, in our simplicity, call it God. You know, Dan, the tail end of that really gets to me, where we in our simplicity call it God, because it just reminds me of the constant struggle we have of taking these multi-dimensional, multiverse concepts and trying to distill them down into two-dimensional language. And so, we do it. The more you get into this, the more you really feel that we're limited. Makes me wonder, wouldn't this be a little easier to discuss through telepathic means?
I want to be there.
Me too. So anyway, with that, let's get into our verses, starting with creation 1:3-1. Before the beginning, there was only one consciousness, that of the Eternal One, whose nature cannot be expressed in words.
Marshall, this is what science has been discovering since the advent of quantum mechanics, that there's a foundation of spiritual consciousness that precedes everything and that everything is built upon it. It is an intelligent designer and force that causes all things to come into being and stay there. In the science world, this is known as Planck's constant. To us, he is simply known as God. There's a series of DVDs out there called What the Bleep Do We Know? And it is a compilation from professors and big-named physicists who are saying this very same thing. They're coming out and saying, guys, this may not be exactly scientific, but what everything is pointing toward is that there is a spiritual basis here for everything, including matter. There's something intelligent out there.
And I agree with that completely, because when I first started working on Earth changes and space threats in 1999, I was just a pure science guy. That was it. Just give me the science, man, just the science. And if Marshall of that time were to see Marshall of today, he'd say, oh, you're one of them. But what really got my eyes to open up was I was watching a documentary that led me to something, and I realized that there have been several Nobel laureates over the years who received their prizes based on the science that they were doing, but that they had gone as far as they could with that, and they were experimenting with spirituality. And that, learning that Nobel laureates were doing that and taking that next step, was really the first step in my own progress, if you will, towards more spiritual understanding, but
Wow.
based with science.
That's interesting.
And that for me is, that was a big turning point in my life, and I've always been grateful. With that, let's move into, and oh, by the way, what the bleep do we know? I saw it when it first came out. I probably watched it a dozen times since then. Folks, if you haven't seen What the Bleep Do We Know, you got to bleeping do it. Get her done. With that, let's get into Creation 1:3-2. It was the one soul spirit, the self-generator, which cannot diminish, the unknown, unknowable, one brooding solitary and profound pregnant silence.
Marshall, I really like a picture that you painted for me one time about a void, and that God, when he became conscious, he looked all over the void, dashing to and fro, trying to find something else in the void or someone else in the void, and that would help him define himself.
Mm-hmm.
He had come into being without knowledge of the process until consciousness really just birthed, and he was awake, and he goes, oh, I am. He was not created, so he just came into being from spontaneously, but he found out that he was alone. And not only was he alone, but he was unknown. No one was yet created to know God, not to fellowship with him. And brooding, I think, here indicates to me that something is going to happen. A plan is being formed. All this is profound silence, pregnant with infinite possibility.
Yes. Think about it, to be born without lineage, to be unsuckled, to just come into existence. And I could imagine God spending eternities of eternities just trying to find possible other members of his or her kind. Would that make sense?
It would. I would have if I had just been birthed.
Yeah. Kind of reminds you of Tom Hanks on that island, remember?
Oh, yeah. I remember.
There you go. Dealing with loneliness. And that brings us to Creation 1:4. The name which is uttered cannot be that of this great being who, remaining nameless, is the beginning and the end. Beyond time, beyond the reach of mortals, and we, in our simplicity, call it God.
It is very understandable that he who is the first cannot be named, having no one to name him. No mom, no dad, there to bring him into the world and name him. He simply is nameless, and that's why he calls himself I am. Beginning of matter, is there an end to matter? And that's a very interesting concept that's pointed out here. It says he is the beginning and the end beyond time. So there's a beginning, and I have to ask the question, is there really an end to matter? Because this sort of references that. Also, as mortals, we are unable to exist in the state that he lives in. In Christian Bible, Moses approaches a burning bush, which turns out to be God. It's this energy that's not consuming the bush. And the story is, God, I really want to see you face to face. And he says, but I can't show you my face, because if I do, the very energy that I'm made of will kill you in your form. So kind of interesting. He said, I'll show you my back though. And so he saw his back, and Moses went away white-haired, and his face was kind of radiant after that when he went back home. It's an interesting story. So where God lives is very different from what we understand about matter and about energy at this point.
Yes, and the thought that there would be an end of time strikes me more as a mortal question than anything else, because we see the end of our lives. We see our own mortality.
Mm-hmm.
But when did time really begin? And if time didn't begin immediately with the inception of God, the creation of God, then when did it begin? And therefore, when would God choose to end it, and in what matter? And those are just questions that seem to fold back in on themselves, because it comes back to the same issues of our own mortality. And I think there we see a reflection of that in the writings in this passage. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that change marks the beginning of time, because God was unchanging, as we've read. He was frustrated because nothing was happening. And then something changed, or is going to change, and it marks the beginning of time. And we're going to see that as we read through these verses. So in my opinion, the advent of change is where the beginning of time is marked. Now, the end of time, I don't know. That's still a question. Maybe we're going to have that answered during this series. We'll see.
Or maybe that was answered when I was back in the Army. Hurry up and wait. All right, well,
yeah,
with that,
end of time.
There you go. With that, let's get into our God question. If you're just now joining this series, before you get into the God readings that we're preparing and showing you, please go back to the first show in the series. We explain everything for you. And please note also that these readings are provided solely as a reference. Now, with that, Dan, what is your question for this show?
I think it's going to come from Creation 1:4, Marshall. And in the specific section that says, is the beginning and the end. He is the beginning and the end. I would ask, God, what was your greatest expectation from creation of the material worlds?
Excellent question. And I did a reading on our previous show.
Very anxious to hear it. God, were the ancestors of humanity other sentient species before us?
Human ancestors were on other worlds long before the earth formed. Humankind is a common species in the cosmos. Your humanoid ancestors come from a long history of experimentation and evolution before the first inception of life occurred in your galaxy. We're a common species, and that actually there was an inception of our type of species, humanoid, before any life occurred in our galaxy. And that is pretty stunning.
We're apparently a somewhat refined species. If it's been that long, if they've been working on us that long, but then I can't imagine how long it took to get it to all work right, So that's a pretty amazing answer. It really is.
I agree. And I'm looking forward to our next show, which is show 5, The Great Circles of Eternity, where we're getting into creation 1:5 and 1:6. So Dan, give our viewers out there a quick look ahead at the next show.
You bet. What does it mean when we read, God is light? The Egyptians felt this light was something tangible for which the material world is created. Which leads us to the question, how was the universe created? And is there an end of time when the universe will cease to exist?
Mm. You know, we're really stuck in this chicken or the egg thing, aren't we?
Maybe next show we'll answer it.
Okay, then I look forward to it. Be there.
See you there.